Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on something that's been all over the news lately, but not always in ways that make a lot of sense. We're talking about Asia specifically. Who has power out there and what that means for, well, everyone else.
Right, because it seems like everyone's got a hot take on China, on the U.S., but the more you read, the more you realize people are oversimplifying things.
Totally, which is why we're diving into an article from Foreign Affairs this week called Asia Has No Hegemon. It's by Susannah, Patton, and Hervé Lemahieu. Came out just last week, actually.
And thank goodness for it, because they're tackling head-on these assumptions a lot of folks have, that China's just going to steamroll everyone, or that the U.S. is doomed, or that we'll magically get this balance of power where nobody's on top.
Yeah, like we see in some other parts of the world. But that seems a bit too optimistic maybe for how things work in Asia.
Right. Well, and the authors make this point that getting the analysis wrong here matters. It's not just some academic debate. It affects how countries make decisions, how they see threats, the whole 9 yards.
So, no pressure to get it right then. But seriously, if these common narratives are off, what are we actually looking at in Asia right now when it comes to who holds the cards?
Well, they have this term, get ready for it, durable duopoly. Basically, it's the U.S. and China neck and neck, which isn't what a lot of people are predicting.
Durable duopoly. Okay, that's a new one. So break it down. What does that actually look like on the ground? How does it play out?
So we've got to get beyond just looking at money, right? GDP isn't the whole picture. The article talks about this Lowy Institute Asia Power Index, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I've seen that mentioned before. It measures more than just like how much money a country has, right?
Exactly. They factor in military, but also stuff like how resilient is a country? How much cultural influence do they have? Diplomatic ties, even their future resources. It paints a much more nuanced picture.
And what's this index telling us about the whole U.S.-China power struggle thing?
Get this, by 2018, China had already hit the level on this index where, historically, transitions of power happen. One country pulls ahead decisively. But here we are.
Okay, so they were in prime position, but something's holding them back. Or is it more complicated than that?
That's the million-dollar question. And this is where Patton and Lemahieu really dig in. They argue that the U.S. and China are wielding their influence in very different ways.
Okay, I'm hooked. Lay it on me, how so? What are they doing differently?
So the U.S., it's still a lot about military might, especially their Navy. And of course, all those alliances they have, those security partnerships, it's that classic big stick approach.
Right, which China doesn't have in the same way, at least not yet.
Exactly. But, and here's where it gets interesting, the article argues the U.S. has some other advantages people often forget about. Advantages that actually go beyond just like tanks and ships.
Okay, like what? Spill the tea. What does the U.S. have going for it that we might be missing?
Well, first off, they're still the global leaders in innovation, attracting the best minds, driving new tech. That stuff has a huge impact.
Makes sense, especially long term, right? If you're the idea factory, you've got a leg up.
For sure. And then there's the whole demographics thing. As grim as things seem in the U.S. sometimes compared to China, their population is actually doing all right. China's getting old fast. And that has huge economic and social implications.
Right. I can't believe we almost forgot about the whole aging population issue. It's a ticking time bomb for some countries. But isn't China making strides in, like, robotics and automation to make up for that? Won't that even the playing field eventually?
Absolutely. They're playing catch-up, but it's not a sure thing. And here's the other ace up the U.S.'s sleeve. The U.S. dollar.
Oh, right, of course. It's so ingrained that we forget how much power it gives the U.S.
It's the global reserve currency, and that gives them a level of influence that's hard to overstate, even if folks don't talk about it as much as, like, aircraft carriers.
So the U.S. has its military muscle, its tech, its demographics. What about China? How are they wielding their power differently?
Well, China's been playing a much longer game, in a way. They've been steadily building up their economic clout, but not through military dominance, at least not in the traditional sense.
Right. It's more about trade deals and those massive infrastructure projects we hear about, right? Like the whole Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. They're creating these webs of economic interdependence. So it's less about forcing countries to do what they want and more about making themselves indispensable partners.
Which, let's be honest, can be just as effective as any military threat in the long run. But if both the U.S. and China are so powerful, each in their own way, how does that explain this durable duopoly idea? Wouldn't one of them have pulled ahead by now?
And that's where things get really interesting. Because the article argues that this kind of standoff, this tension between the two, is actually a source of stability in the region.
Wait, hold up. Are you saying all this competition, this rivalry, is a good thing?
In a way, yeah. Think about it. For all the potential flashpoints in Asia, all the places where things could blow up, there hasn't been a major conflict in decades.
That's true, especially when you compare it to, like, Europe, which seems to be constantly on edge, or the Middle East, which is, well, the Middle East. So you're saying this U.S.-China power struggle, this durable duopoly, is keeping a lid on things.
That's what the article argues. And it kind of makes sense. Neither side wants to rock the boat too much because the stakes are so high.
So it's like this high-stakes poker game where nobody wants to blink first because the consequences are too scary to contemplate.
Right.
But that only works if both players stay in the game, right? What happens if the U.S. decides to pack up and go home?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something a lot of countries in Asia are worried about. Because if the U.S. steps back, even a little, it could embolden China to make moves they wouldn't otherwise risk.
So the U.S. is kind of like the reluctant sheriff in town. Nobody really loves them being there, but they'd miss them if they left.
That's a great way to put it. And it creates this really tough situation for the U.S. because they have to project strength, they have to show they're committed to the region, but without being overly aggressive and making China feel threatened.
Talk about a tightrope walk, right? Okay, so we've got the U.S. and China, each with their own strengths, locked in this tense but oddly stable standoff. But there are a lot of other players in Asia, right? Where do they fit into all of this?
Right. We can't forget about all the other countries trying to navigate this U.S.-China rivalry. And that's where things get even more interesting because those non-aligned countries, the ones who haven't explicitly picked a side, they're the wild card.
The wild card, huh?
Yeah.
So which way are they leaning?
Well, that's what we need to figure out. Well, the article points to some, let's just say, interesting developments. Like they talk about Malaysia and how they're starting to side more with China on the whole Taiwan issue, which is, a pretty big deal.
Yeah, that's definitely raising eyebrows.
Yeah.
And Malaysia's not exactly a tiny player in the region either.
Exactly. And then there's Indonesia, talk about a country to watch. They're making it pretty clear that they see China as their most important economic partner, which, let's be real, gives China a lot of leverage.
No kidding. So even if these countries aren't formally aligning with China, they're feeling the pull. It's like China's economic gravity is just too strong to resist.
And the article even mentions some, shall we say, concerning reports about China potentially getting a military base in Cambodia. Now, nothing's confirmed there, but even the possibility is a huge deal.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a game changer. So what's the U.S. supposed to do? If throwing money around isn't enough to counter China's influence, what's the play?
That's the big question, right? And it's something Patton and Lemahieu grapple with in the article. They argue that it's not about just trying to outspend China. It's about the U.S. showing up as a reliable, trustworthy partner.
So less about flashing the cash, more about building genuine relationships. Easier said than done, right?
100%. It's about diplomacy. It's about cultural exchange. And yes, it's about economic engagement too, but in a way that benefits everyone, not just lining the pockets of a few elites.
Right, because that's what China's been accused of doing with some of their projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more about winning influence than mutual benefit. So the U.S. needs to offer a real alternative, not just more of the same.
Absolutely. And they have to prove to these non-aligned nations that long-term, they've got more to gain by working with the U.S.
Which, let's be honest, is a tough sell when China's knocking on your door with a blank check. So if we're listening to this, trying to make sense of all this durable duopoly stuff, what's the key takeaway? What should we be paying attention to as this whole thing plays out?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. The future of Asia. Totally up in the air. This isn't some foregone conclusion where one country wins and everyone else loses. It's messy, it's dynamic, and frankly, that makes it way more interesting to analyze.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. So instead of trying to predict who's going to come out on top, we should be watching how these different players adapt and react. Like, what moves is the U.S. going to make?
Precisely. Are they going to double down on the right partnerships? Are they actually engaging with these non-aligned countries in a way that resonates? Because, on the flip side, we also need to keep an eye on those non-aligned nations themselves.
Because they're calling the shots in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
If they decide to jump on the China bandwagon, the U.S. is in trouble.
100%. They're the swing vote in all of this. And how they navigate this increasingly complicated geopolitical landscape, well, That's going to determine the future of the region, maybe even the world.
Okay, so we've got this durable duopoly, this uneasy peace between the U.S. and China, but underneath that, there's this whole other competition for influence going on. And the country is caught in the middle. They hold the keys to the castle.
And that's what makes it all so fascinating, right? It's like a giant game of chess, but with sky-high stakes, and nobody knows who's going to make the next move.
Talk about a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are hooked on this geopolitical thriller, where can they go to learn more, to really dig into the nitty-gritty of this durable duopoly?
Well, the article, it's called Asia Has No Hegemon, by the way. It's right there in the title. They make this point that even with the U.S. maybe not being the powerhouse it once was, its presence alone has, kind of weirdly, helped keep things stable.
It's like they're the anchor, even if it's a slightly rusty anchor these days. But what happens if that anchor starts dragging? Like if the power gap between the U.S. and China keeps shrinking?
Ooh, now you're asking the million-dollar question. Can we actually get to a world where it's not just these two behemoths calling the shots, where power is more spread out, more countries have a say?
A genuinely multipolar Asia, instead of just this durable duopoly, sounds great in theory, but...
But is it realistic? And if it as possible, how do we even get there? What role do these non-aligned countries need to play? Because, let's be honest, they might have more influence over the outcome than either the U.S. or China realizes.
Okay, now my head's spinning a little bit. This is why I love these deep dives, though. So many things to think about. So, for our listeners who are as fascinated by this durable duopoly as we are, where can they go to learn more?
Well, besides reading the full Foreign Affairs article, which seriously everyone should, I'd say keep an eye on those non-aligned countries. They're the wild cards. See who they're making deals with, what their rhetoric is like, even who they're sending their students to study abroad. Those little things can tell you a lot about where things are headed.
Great advice. It's like that old saying, the devil's in the details. Or in this case, the future of Asia might be in the details. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks to our expert for, well, being an expert. And to all of you for listening in and hopefully getting as fired up about this stuff as we are.
My pleasure. Always a good time.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep exploring the world around you. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.